I want to introduce our guest and my dear friend. Goldish holds the Samuel N. and Esther Melton Chair in History at the Ohio State University. He's written about the history of Sephardim after their expulsion from Spain, the Messianic movement of Shabbat, the theology of Sir Isaac Newton. That was the first thing of math I read, actually, I can say. I remember that. Spirit possession in Judaism, Jewish-Christian intellectual relations, and other topics. And it's really an honor to have him here tonight. This is part of my seminar at Revel. This is part of my seminar Revel titled The Sephardic Atlantic, which is exploring all sorts of aspects of post-expulsion Sephardic experience, life, culture, so this is really an honor to have Professor Goldish here to take us deep into some more complex realities. I'm hearing I'm picking up. Am I picking up? I am.
A little bit.
Terrible. I'm really sorry about that.
The beard, it makes you fuzzy.
The beard is fuzzy. It's so true. Okay, well, I'm going to soon stop talking. Oh, I'm really embarrassed. I'm sorry about that. I'll just say this, we're going to explore, we're going to go deep into the complexities of rabbinic culture in this world. And I'm really happy that you're all here. I see some other new friends, old friends. I see Phil Lieberman, wonderful. And this is great. Okay, all right, welcome everybody. And like I said, please send things to the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Goldish.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Yes, I'm amazed and thrilled to see everybody here, including my cousin Maish, whom I haven't seen in person in I don't know how long. B'chlod Achsanya, I'm grateful to Ronnie. Thank you to Revel for hosting this talk, and thank you to everybody attending. I also have the chat open so I can see any comments or questions. So here is how I plan to sort of structure my time. I'll talk for maybe about a half hour, questions or comments for maybe 15 minutes, and then about 45 minutes to look at some texts, which I think have been distributed, but maybe Ronnie, you'll screen share them when we get to them, if that makes sense. Okay, so here's what we will be discussing, what I will be talking about for the first about half hour. First, a quick review of the origins of the Western Sephardi Diaspora and my own theory about that. Then, where did Western Sephardi communities find rabbis, and what kinds of rabbis did they bring? What were the roles of rabbis among the Western Sephardim? In what ways were they similar to the roles in other communities, and what ways were they different? Within that context, some specific problems with the communities of the Western Sephardim from the rabbinic point of view. I want to say that my teacher, Professor Kaplan, has written about all kinds of aspects of these communities, but especially has brought our attention to the deviance right at the center of the community. And then there's an enormous literature about Spinoza and Da Costa and issues of heretics who are far out at the edges of the community in a lot of way. So what I have kind of focused on in some of my research, and what we will be talking about later here, is a different group, which is people who are at the edges of the community. They've sort of got one foot in and one foot out. These are people whom the rabbis deal with a lot. And so we'll be taking a look at a little bit about those people. Okay, so concerning the origins of these communities, I assume, I didn't realize that there were so many people who are going to be here who are not actually in the course. I'd sort of assumed that the origins of these communities and the former conversos had kind of been, that was already familiar to people. But for people who are not normally in the course, I'll just say that after the expulsion from Spain, there are, right, or even for the century leading up to the expulsion, and then in its aftermath, there are communities of people who leave Spain, who either establish communities or join communities that are already in existence and maintain their Jewish life with their Sephardi traditions straight through. That is what's called the Eastern Sephardi Diaspora, because those people generally go to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, and in some cases to Italy, and they maintain their Jewish life. Then there are the people who, by hook or by crook, are converted to Christianity, the conversos, and they are sort of leaving in a stream, sometimes more, sometimes less, over the next several centuries into the 18th century. Even as late as the period of the American Revolution, we have stories about sailors of Jewish origin who jumped ship and joined Jewish communities in the West and so on. So at a certain point, some of those people, rather than joining existing Jewish communities in Saloniki or in Kushta in Constantinople, which the Jews continue to call it rather than calling it Istanbul, or Venice or someplace like that, they chose to create their own communities, which were made up entirely of former conversos. That is what is called the Western Sephardi Diaspora. That's what we will be dealing with. That's what I know, Ronnie, you've been dealing with mostly in your classes. Those communities, the most central of them, and the most influential is the one in Amsterdam, but it also includes London, Livorno, Hamburg, Bayonne, Bordeaux, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, and then the communities in the New World. So these are communities which are not entirely, but are mostly made up of former conversos and their descendants, people who are coming out of a new Christian background. Okay, so a key point in our discussion about these people is Kaplan's point, Joseph Kaplan's point. He says, often the communities that these people live in, Amsterdam, London, Livorno, these are places which did not have Jewish communities before. And while it is not our topic here to discuss how these communities are established, he points out that in many cases, the Jewish communities in which these former conversos live, in Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, Livorno, these are the first Jewish communities they have ever seen in their lives. In other words, they have never lived as Jews before. They don't know how you live as a Jew. And this, of course, becomes the center of the difficulties for the rabbis in these communities. That in many cases, these former conversos are creating communities without having ever lived in a Jewish community. Okay, so the usual theory about the origins of these communities is that they have to do with economics. And I agree with that to a large degree, that that is a major part of the reason that these new Western communities are established, especially under the impact of the Spanish, when Antwerp, which had been a kind of haven of conversos living sort of secret Jewish life, had been busted open by the government and was no longer viable, that people started going to Amsterdam in particular, London, and so on. But I think that there's another component here, a religious component, which I would like to point out. Ronnie is laughing. Uh-oh. Even if my zipper was open, you wouldn't know it. So I don't know what you're laughing at. Okay, I'll have to hear later. Let's say that you are a converso, somebody who had grown up Jewish in Spain or in Portugal, had been converted to Christianity in 1492, 1497. Now it's the year, let's say 1510, and you find a way to escape, and you go to Saloniki or to Fez or wherever you go, and you revert to Judaism. People may look down on you. Oh, you lived as a Christian. They may give you a hard time and so on. But you know how to live as a Jew. You have had that experience. You just move back into Jewish life. Let's say that it is now 1570. You are a descendant of conversos. You have never lived as a Jew. You may feel strongly about being Jewish. You may feel strongly that you want to revert to Judaism. Some people do, many people don't. But yeah, interesting, Alan Harris. Okay, we'll get to that. You may feel strongly about your Jewish identity, but if you go to Saloniki or to Fez, you are going to be a preschooler in Jewish law and Jewish practice and Jewish texts, in prayer, in everything. In a community of people who have lived their entire lives as Jews, you are going to have no idea what you're doing, and it's going to be very embarrassing and very difficult, especially since many of these conversos back in the Iberian Peninsula were extremely well educated in ways that Jews never could be, are often wealthy in ways that Jews usually weren't. You have a sort of Hidalgo identity, which is a whole other subject, which, Ronnie, we should talk about sometime, but there's this kind of jaha, I don't know, this kind of attitude that these people have, and they don't want to live among people who will look down on them religiously. This is what I think, and there's some hints at that in the literature, that is one of the reasons they start moving into places in which Jews were never allowed to live, and they are able to create their own communities in the style which they want. And not be beholden to people who look down on them religiously. Okay. Now, where did these communities find rabbis? So here, I just want to address Alan Harris's question. Why do we focus on the Sephardi rabbis as if they weren't mainstream when the two leading halachic authorities, the Rambam and Yosef Karo, were Sephardim? Should we rather try to understand why the Ashkenazi rabbis deviated from the Sephardi minhagim and halachic literature? I'm not going to address that question because that is a bit off our topic, but without going into it, yeah, you're right, totally. There's the period we are talking about, in the early modern period, Sephardim looked down on Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim were the poor, unkulturni brothers, you know, from the cousins from that you tried to, you know, kind of, they were embarrassing. You tried not to let people see that you were related. There's this awful moment during the French Revolution where the French Sephardim come to the French authorities and say, we don't know who these other people are that you keep associating us with. We're the real Jews and we're very cultured and so on. We do whatever you want with them, but awful, especially after Matthias Lehmann has introduced us to the idea of pan-Judaism, which is a whole different thing. Anyway, the long and short of it is, in the modern period, suddenly Ashkenazim are the big cheese and the Sephardim are looked down on, but that's not the way it was in the period we're dealing with, in quite the opposite. Okay.
Matt, I just want to add some, I saw contemporaneously in a contemporary, like a popular Sephardi halachic email, they referred to the Ramah as someone who wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. I just thought that they were trying to explain who is this Moshe Isserlis.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, having been sort of on the inside of the community of Chaladim, I've sort of seen that attitude. It's still around. We just don't see it that much. Okay, So where do the Western Sephardi communities find rabbis? So there are definitely sort of two stages here, although they slop over onto each other. During the earlier years of these communities, so these communities of the Western Sephardim, right, the Western Sephardi Diaspora really starts right around the beginning of the 17th century, just before that maybe. And from then until the 1720s, the 1620s, late 1620s maybe, these communities imported all their rabbis. They didn't have anybody else. So, for example, in Amsterdam, Joseph Pardo was brought from the Ottoman Empire. Isaac Uziel was brought from Fez. Shaul Halevi Mortera is a fascinating case. He was a student of Leon de Modena in Venice, and he was, well, I won't go into the whole thing, but he was actually an Ashkenazi Italian Jew, and the Sephardim couldn't quite figure out what to do with him because he didn't fit any of their frameworks, but he was a Rav in the community for decades, but they were all imports. Then by the late 1720s, early 1730s, the Talmud Torah in Amsterdam is producing its own Hakhamim. And so more and more, the Hakhamim of the community are their own products. So that's Menashe ben Israel, Yitzhak Abuhab de Fonseca, Shlomo Oliveira, Moshe Rafael de Aguilar, etc. Those are homegrown products, right, who are trained in Amsterdam. And later the Amsterdam Yeshiva is actually exporting rabbis all over the Western Sephardi diaspora itself. These early rabbis were accustomed, obviously, to normative Jewish communities, and these communities of the Western Sephardim were a huge challenge to them because, as Kaplan has written extensively and as you've read a little bit, they are not normative communities. So the rabbis are really stuck in a situation where they have to either fight the Parnasim and the leaders about halachic and Jewish traditional issues, or they have to compromise, and we'll talk more about that. I should say that Hakhamim are still sometimes imported to these communities later in the 17th century. And the two figures that we're going to be reading about a little bit are Shlomo Ayalon and Yaakov Sasfortas. They are both imports. Ayalon is apparently from Saloniki, and Sasfortas is from North Africa. And they are both Hakhamim of those communities late in the 17th century. Okay, the roles of Western Sephardi rabbis and special problems. So some aspects of their roles as Hakhamim are the same as they are in other communities. Some of them are quite different. So like other rabbis, they deliver sermons, they teach at the community school, and at least in certain contexts, they answer legal questions. What is different about their roles? Well, they had to contend with adult neophytes. In other words, every time a converso came from either the Iberian Peninsula or from France or from someplace where they had been practicing Christianity outwardly and joined the community, which again was happening heavily in the beginning part of the 17th century, but really kept going on through the century. The Chacham had to figure out how to think about this person as a Jew, what is their status, and then they had to incorporate them into the community. These are people, it's not even like the Balei Tshuva of today. These are people who haven't got a clue about rabbinic practice and halacha, and even the sort of the structure of Judaism. Many of them have a sort of biblical idea of what Judaism is. So they have neophytes, right? They have to educate people who are adults, sometimes wealthy, often educated, often very snooty about who they are, but know nothing about Judaism. That is a huge challenge. And a part of the challenge is that these people have all the money and the power, the Hakhamim, or the experts on Judaism, but they are completely at the control, at the beck and call of the Parnasim and the Ma'amad. Right, many of these people were unruly and unwilling to submit completely to rabbinic authority. In this context, I want to read you a classic passage from Uriel de Costa, who came to the community in the 1620s, I think, and he wrote an autobiography. Some parts of this may have been potchkid with, but this passage rings completely true. So listen to what he says about his arrival from Portugal. There are things he doesn't tell you. He spent time in Hamburg on the way and so on, but here is what he tells us about his arrival in Amsterdam. He says, being arrived in Amsterdam, where we found the Jews professing their religion with great freedom, as the law directs there, we immediately fulfilled the precept concerning circumcision. I assume he's speaking about the males in his party. I had not been there many days before I observed that the customs and ordinances of the modern Jews were very different from those commanded by Moses. In other words, he's telling us, I knew about what Jews do from the Bible. And what I was seeing in Amsterdam was very different from that. Now, if the law was to be strictly observed according to the letter, as it expressly declares, in other words, the Torah says, right, don't change a letter of the law, right, it must be very unjustifiable in the Jewish doctors to add to it inventions of a quite contrary nature. This provoked me to oppose them openly. Imagine yourself in the position of a rabbi in the Western Sephardi communities dealing with a guy like Da Costa, right? He's just arrived from Portugal and he's the expert because he knows the Bible, and the Bible says not to change anything, and the way Judaism is practiced in 1620 or 1630 looks nothing like the Bible. This provoked me to oppose them openly. Nay, I looked upon it as doing God's service to defend the law with freedom against such innovations. The modern Jewish rabbins, like their ancestors, are an obstinate and perverse race of men, strenuous advocates for the odious sect of the Pharisees and their institutions, not without a view to gain, and, as is justly imputed to them, vainly fond of the uppermost seats in the synagogue and greetings in the market. Now, if you've ever checked into a hotel and looked in the drawer, you may have opened up the Bible there and read some passages in the New Testament. This is somebody who is steeped in not only the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but also in the opinions of the New Testament. Some of these things that he just said are almost verbatim comments about the Pharisees and the rabbis made in the New Testament. So that is his context. He comes in with an opinion about the rabbis that is based on the views about the Pharisees from the New Testament. Men of this character could not bear that I should differ from them, though in the most minute points, insisting upon my following their steps exactly in everything, or else threatening to exclude me from the synagogue and to pass full sentence of the greater excommunication upon me. So imagine, as a rabbi, here you have this character who's a big expert on what Judaism should be, and you have spent your life studying the texts of the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, and maybe even the Ramah, and you're concerned with every aspect of halacha, and here's this guy who wants to argue with you. But as it was unworthy of him who had so lately left his native country, talking about himself, right, and been content to forego many other temporal advantages for liberty of conscience, to be overawed and forced to submit to men who had no right to such power besides. to such power. Besides, I thought it both sinful and beneath a man to be a slave in things pertaining to conscience, etc. And so he talks about his rebellion against the rabbis. That's the koshta. Now, Yerushalmi has written about this. Other people have written that there's a lot of fiction in this, and that the idea that he knew nothing about rabbinic Judaism and was just completely shocked to find Judaism being practiced this way. This statement still kind of gives you a sense of how conversos, who had expected something about the way Judaism was, or perhaps even freedom of conscience, right, which was just barely a concept then, encountered the rabbinic Judaism of the Western Sephardi diaspora. And since we're looking at it from the point of view of the rabbis, you can imagine what this meant. Okay. There's also a tendency among all the conversos, not just people like Da Costa or Spinoza, to identify more with the concept of the Nação than with the concept of being Jewish. Being Jewish didn't speak to them. They saw themselves as part of a group, the nation, the Nação, of Portuguese conversos and former conversos. They felt more kinship with a brother or a cousin who was still in Portugal practicing Christianity than they did with the Ashkenazi who lived next door, or even with the North African Sephardi who lived next door. That is the concept of the Nação. And Kaplan has written a lot about it. Miriam Bodian has written some about it. And that is, this gives you a sense of how these communities are sort of leaning toward the way Judaism actually looks today, where it's more of an ethnic identity or more of a peoplehood than it is a life, a set of practices. And of course, for the rabbis, it's quite different. So these people look at their new identity in the Western Sephardi world in this way, whereas the rabbis look at it in this way. They're cutting different directions and they are bound to clash. Okay. Some of these people got their hands on these manuals of halachic practice that were designed for these newly arriving conversos. Menashe ben Israel wrote one, and other people wrote them. And Sasfortas complains about this, that you see sometimes somebody will get their hands on one of these manuals and think that they are now a big expert in Jewish law, and they'll face off against the rabbi over some problem. The rabbi will say, well, this is forbidden, and the person will say, well, it's permitted. Here, look, and they'll open their little handbook, right? Like imagine somebody opening like I don't know, a Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, art scroll, something, and trying to argue with the greatly learned rabbi. This happened to them too. That was another problem the rabbis were dealing with. Most of the congregants knew nothing about Jewish law and Jewish practice. Some congregants flouted rabbinic authority. So there were the famous figures, who openly rebelled, like the Costa and Spinoza and De Prado and Ribera. But there was a lot more of a widespread, low-level resistance to rabbinic authority, as it turns out, that we don't hear about when we read about those famous figures. The rabbis had to figure out how to integrate new Jews, what their halachic status was. The rabbis had to, here is something else they had to do. They had to pussyfoot around Choshen Mishpat laws, because the people, this is the period of the early Enlightenment. It's the period of mercantilism. The people, if you've ever read David Liss's book, The Coffee Trader, or any of his books about these people, right? You get the sense of how this looks from the point of view of the members of the community. They're business people, and they are deeply involved in trade, especially the Atlantic trade in particular, although they certainly have connections back to the Mediterranean as well. And they are all about rebate, essentially, because capitalism, mercantilism, is built entirely on lending money and lending money at interest. That's the cornerstone of the community. The rabbis had to find a way to either turn a blind eye to these things, or be mora heter somehow for what was going on. I did a little survey of the She'elot Utshuvot, the few volumes that come out of the Western Sephardi context. Very, very few She'elot on hardcore rebate issues or other issues from a Choshen Mishpat. So the rabbis have to deal with, right, what are they going to do about what they know is going on when these people are outside the synagogue. And another aspect of the job of the Chacham in these communities is that these this is the period of the early Enlightenment, and many Christians have taken a great interest in Jews and what Jews do. There are not so many Jews in Western Europe, especially at the beginning of the century. That's why Shakespeare had to set his story of the Merchant of Venice in Venice. It was also because if the Merchant of Venice lived somewhere else, then it would sound very funny calling him the Merchant of Venice, but that's another story, right? Venice was one of the few places that had a Jewish community. So as Jewish communities appear openly in Western Europe, Christians are fascinated. So first of all, they're always stopping by to observe the services, and that creates a certain amount of tension and pressure for the rabbis. And also they come to the rabbis for what is the Jewish opinion on this very sensitive Christian issue. Does God set the length of life when you're born, or is it variable? You know, what do the Jews think of this passage in Isaiah? What do the Jews think about, right? So you have rabbis to the Christians now, there's just appeared a fascinating book about Menashe ben Israel as a rabbi to the Christians. It was a topic that was dealt with a lot by Leon de Modena of Venice earlier in the 17th century, and that role sort of shifts over a lot to Menashe, and to a lesser degree to some of the other rabbis in the Western Sephardi Diaspora to deal with the Christians. Okay, so my focus.
Matt, there's, first of all, whose book is that? Do you remember the author?
Sina Rauschenbach.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, that's great. And wait a second. Oh, nice. Oh, yeah. That's exciting. You've been working on this for a while.
Recently translated from German, and people love it. Here, there's a comment on the back. Sina Rauschenbach's excellent erudite study sheds extensive light on the Jewish-Christian relations in the 17th century Dutch Republic and so on. That was by a guy named Matt Goldish. Anyway, there are various haskamot on the back. Excellent book if you're interested in that subject.
And then there's a question from Ocean. Ocean's question was, you're talking about these difficulties. You mentioned Choshen Mishpat issues, financial issues that they avoided. Are there other issues that come up with consistency where there's just this real divide between what the Hakhamim think is standard and basic and what the people they're just not going to do?
So in most other areas, it's a question of ignorance or of, I don't know what you would call it, sloth or habit. So a lot of people are not interested in the sort of stricter practices of Shabbat and of kashrut and so on. The other really sensitive one is Brit Milah. So anybody, and so I know, Ronnie, you gave everyone the article from Kaplan about travels to the land of idolatry. That was one of them, right? So a lot of people who have business interests still in areas of France where Jews aren't allowed to live, or back in the Iberian Peninsula, they know that if they're caught going there, that the first thing they're going to do is tell them to drop trowel, right? They're going to tell them to expose whether they have a brit milah. So they do not want to get a brit in order to not have that problem, because they know that they're going to be going back. That becomes an area of a lot of tension. Strangely, in the documents we're looking at today, you get the opposite effect later in the century, where people want a brit milah, but they don't want all the commitment and the membership in the community that tend to go with that. So that's another big area of contention. So that's what I would say, right? There are the areas, those two particular areas, right? Business and brit milah, which kind of go together. And then on the other hand, the sort of general sloth or ignorance having to do with the rest of the body of halachic practice. What Kaplan has pointed out is that an excessive amount of holiness and care are dedicated to synagogue and synagogue practices, and it's deceiving. Visitors are very impressed by this, but what it means is that essentially this is hallowed ground, this is a holy place, this is the synagogue. When you're other places, you know, you do what you need to do, whatever. When you're here, you act very holy and you do all of that. That is a kind of concept taken directly out of Catholicism. But people aren't necessarily aware of that. So that's another piece of this story. Let's see, the Rambam. Okay, yeah. Should I finish up here? Okay. Your microphone's off, so I don't know what you're saying, but I'm reading your lips. You seem to be saying yes. Carry on. Okay. So Yosef Kaplan has taught us a huge amount about the nature of these communities and all kinds of things about them. He and other scholars have taught us about every aspect from the middle to the outside of this social spectrum. Kaplan especially teaches us about the center of the communities, and he has been at pains to show us that these communities, although they look sort of super orthodox to outsiders because of the issue that I just mentioned about the synagogues, that they are in fact deviant from the very center outward. And that was part of the purpose of that article about travels to the lands of idolatry. The Spinoza scholarship has taught us all about the radicals, and there's an enormous literature about Spinoza and Da Costa and their types of people, right? The open radicals. But the rabbinic material, which I'm most interested in, often tells you about these groups on the margins, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And we talked about the issue that they have with Brit Milah. Yeah, so that was kind of what I wanted to say. And if people have questions or comments, this is a good time.
I wanted to add something about the Brit Milah. Professor Kaplan, we had the honor of having him here at Revel a few years back, and he chose to speak about this issue of Brit Milah, and Brit Milah is a dividing line, and how the Hakhamim really fought to make it a real dividing line and force people to come in or out. And so, you know, I'm happy you brought it up, because it was something that it's a really powerful test case of sorts, right? So
yeah, Ronnie, he later published that article that he gave at Revel.
I think yeah. I'm trying to remember. I think he gave a continuation of it at another conference I heard him at, but yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Matt, do you have an idea of how this might change in the 18th century when rabbis are now dealing with second or third generation new Jews? Is there, what's your sense about what the role looks like as you get deeper into the 18th century?
Okay, so that is a super good question. And we tend to talk about these communities and these issues as if they are a unified situation across the 17th and let's say into the middle of the 18th century. They're actually a moving target, because some of the people at any given time are newly arrived conversos who know really very little about Judaism. Some of the people in the community are already second generation there and have grown up as Jews, but as Jews in this odd way that Amsterdam or London produces. And then some people, right, there are always a number of people who are completely familiar with Judaism, who have lived as Jews, who have moved to these communities for whatever reason. So there's always this mixture. But you're absolutely right that by the time you get to the later 17th century into the 18th century, most of the members of the community have already lived as Jews their entire lives, and sometimes even their parents or grandparents they have become sort of the norm in the community. And again, these communities have their own kind of unique form of Jewish practice. Even today, if you go to the Esnoga in Amsterdam and you watch, there was a guy named Bahar, who's actually a Turkish Jew in his origins, although I think he was born in Amsterdam, now lives in Israel. He is the living memory of what it was like before the war. He went through the camps and everything, and he came back. And you watch him, at least when he lived in Amsterdam, you watch him or watch the people that he trained and the way they run the service. It looks distinctly different than any other Sephardic service. So it's different, but it does become its own form of normative, as you say, in the later 17th and in the 18th century. That doesn't mean that there weren't still people arriving and fighting, that, and there was always this this borderline foot in and foot out group that we'll be talking about. But it does look distinctly different. And as Kaplan has been talking about over the last several years, confessionalism has really sort of passed by. By the time you're deep in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the people who go to the Esnoga, the people who participate in the community, are strictly voluntary. There's no longer a coercive situation in which everybody has to be a member of a church or the synagogue. In Amsterdam, there and in London too, I suppose, right? There, people have choices, and therefore you get a more normative and dedicated looking community. At least this is what he argues, because the people who don't really want to be part of it are already off doing whatever they feel like doing. They are part of the larger community, and they are no longer this concept, chrétien sans église, right? The Christians without a church, which was a radical thing in the 17th century, becomes very common in the 18th, and the same thing for Jews. If you don't feel like belonging, you go do your own thing, and therefore those who do belong, right, it tightens down. And that way it's somewhat similar to Orthodox Jewish life in the present. It's strictly voluntary.
Could you explain that term again, confessionalism? Explain that a little bit. I mean, you just did, but if you can kind of give a little bit more background on that, because I think it's a really fundamental idea.
So in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, there is a tightening down of the way that the government and the church of each European state sort of work together. That there should be an official state church, that everybody in theory is a member of that church, and that the state and the church are sort of identical. And then you have multi-confessional states like the German states, where some of the states are Catholic and some of them are Protestant, Lutheran, right? So that whole sort of locking together, just imagine, speaking locking, right? John Locke, who is writing just in the period of these documents we're going to be looking at, just in that period, right, the very end of the 17th century, is introducing this. Spinoza introduces the idea, even Da Costa introduces the idea of some kind of separation of church and state, or the idea that churches and religious authority should not have power. That is a radical idea, but those are ideas which become rather popular, especially among the the more learned classes. And so confessionalism is sort of on its way out in a certain way, especially in England, where you have so many dissenters, and the Dutch Republic, right, where you have so many dissenters. You have Reform, you have in the Dutch Republic, you have the Remonstrants and the Counter-Remonstrants, right? You have these different streams. So it's no longer possible to be a completely confessionalized church. And that's where you get into the situation where, for example, for the Jews, as we're seeing, right, membership in the synagogue became voluntary rather than being, right, you're either a Christian and a member of the state church, or we will allow you to be a Jew and a member of the synagogue. Those are your only choices. Spinoza was considered maybe the first person to be able to fall between the cracks in the Dutch Republic and not be a member of one or the other. Let's see. I see there are a couple more questions.
Can I ask a follow-up on
Yes,
that?
please.
Sorry, because it's so, you know, in the medieval period, Jews paid their taxes via the community. The community paid the taxes of the Jews. When does that stop in a place like Amsterdam? Because I think it certainly continues longer in other places, but a place like Amsterdam or London, does that stop? In other words, because that would lock you in. I mean, if you're not part of the community, what is your legal status? How do you pay your taxes? How do you kind of, right? So
I do not know really the answer to that question. I'm not sure. It may be that from the very beginnings of these communities, they do not have that
it doesn't
corporate structure. I think that may be the case, that people are assessed individually rather than as a community. And you're right, that would be a radical shift from the normal situation of Jews in Europe. So let me just see what some of these questions are. What were some of the heterim that these rabbis might have given as a concession to their community? So, you know, if you've ever done something like run, this is a YU crowd, right? If you've ever run a beginner's minyan or something like that, you know that there's a whole body of halacha that's all about what can you do, you know, it's Rosh Hashanah. If you go through the whole service, you're going to drive everybody away, you know, how do you, right? So the rabbis had, right, they would rely on a kula where they could, for certain things, but what's interesting in these communities is in terms of rebate, in particular in business law, it looks like they just turned a blind eye a lot of times. They just didn't, right? My friend Joel Petlin always said, it's not a shaila if you don't ask it, which in the technical sense is true. I think that's the way these rabbis regarded it. If nobody asks me, I'm not going to get involved. And that was their way of dealing with it. I have to say that in the community in which I live, I think that's what goes on a lot also. The rabbi does not necessarily have to go out of his way to tell people where they are transgressing if nobody asks him. And if he does, he is taking a certain risk. Sasfortas did it in London, and if it weren't for the Great Fire and the Great Plague of London, he would no doubt have been tarred and feathered and run out of town. Maybe the one person to have some benefit from the Great Plague of 1666, although I hate to say it that way, 1665, 66. And Chacham Uziel in Amsterdam really ran into these problems also, right? He didn't stand by and turn a blind eye. He told people, you know, you can't do this, you can't be doing that. So this is an ongoing issue for the rabbis of these communities. And they really, as I said, they have to do one thing or the other. They have to either stand up and fight the way Uziel or Sasfortas did, or they have to kind of turn a blind eye. Those are kind of the choices. Oh, wait, okay, so there are a couple more questions here. Oh, Phil Lieberman is here. Oh, I'm so honored. I'm so honored. Okay. To what extent does this confessionalism provide a basic Jewish education, since individuals who are required to be part of one or the other community need to know a bit about Jewish law simply to live their life according to the confessional norms? So I don't know that confessionalism requires any particular thing. most Christians in most of Europe, despite the whole Counter-Reformation, despite the whole creation of the mendicant orders, everything else, most of them probably had only a very surface understanding of Christianity. But then they didn't have halakha, they didn't have this extensive body of laws. So I think that the rabbis did what they could to educate people, but the existence of this big pool of kind of fence sitters indicates that maybe this wasn't always so successful, and maybe not everybody wanted to be so educated in halakha. And what they did at home in private, who knew, right? Okay. Ocean, a lot of scholars emphasize the role of women in crypto Judaism. Do we have any evidence of the tension between these women and the new rabbinic leadership? Not really. My impression is that women in these communities did what they did, usually at home, and we don't hear much from them in the Pinkasim or in the literature. Every once in a while, one of them pops up for one reason or another. Where they do show up a lot is in the discussions of poverty in the community. And there's a terrific book on that subject. And there are lots of women involved there, but they're not protesting against the rabbis. I would guess that their protest against the rabbis, if they had a problem with the rabbis, was done at home in private, you know, by slipping some bacon into the matzah or I don't know, whatever. But women often tended to be much more conforming and much more interested in sort of the holiness of the Jewish community and so on. That's my impression.
Matt, you know,
yeah.
I would just add something on that line about women. I have a question connected to that. What do we know about their education? You know, they weren't part of the impressive system of education at the Hakhamim, you know, Yeshiva and stuff like that. But they clearly, I mean, there are a lot of books that are clearly written for them, right? In vernacular. We have a lot of these books that seem to be clearly, you know, directed towards women. What do we know about their education? Do you know? I mean, is this something you've looked into?
No, I really don't know anything about it. I don't know whether there were books that were intended for Portuguese or Sephardi Jewish women that were produced in the Western Sephardi diaspora. The big collection of such books is really intended for Ashkenazi women, the Tzena Reina and that whole genre, the Tchinas and so on. I don't know that there's any parallel in the Portuguese or Western Sephardi world. Mm-hmm. So I don't know much about it.
Yeah, but it is interesting, Ocean. You know, so much is made about in the crypto Jewish world, those people who want to hold on to Judaism. It seems that women are the central, very often the central leadership, and then you show up to Amsterdam and it's totally hierarchical and, you know, very classically, you know, gender split and.
Well, the simple explanation for that, as Neanderthal as it sounds today, but probably true, is that in the world of crypto Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula and France and so on, there is no public practice of Judaism, and the public practice is the practice that's dominated by men. Therefore, all the practices occur at home in secret, and the home is dominated by women. And now all of a sudden, when you move back into a context where there is an enormous public practice of Judaism, the women probably continue to do what they do, but what we hear about is the men, and mostly men who are writing and who are educated and right. Who are composing documents. So that's right. that's yeah. Simple.
Yeah, Laura Liebman has done some good work on thinking about material culture and what that may say about women's religiosity.
Yes.
And all sorts of other things. It's some really, really interesting work. But certainly books, you know, it's a different world.
Right. What's your daughter's name?
Emanuela.
Hi, Emanuela. Nice to see you. Is she interested in Western Sephardim?
Thankfully, not too much. She has more important things to worry about.
All right. Should we move on to documents?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. We've got a flat half hour here.
Perfect.
Okay. I have been particularly interested in three Hakhamim in particular over a lot of years who all served in multiple communities of the Western Sephardi Diaspora. The one place that they all have in common is London. That is Chacham Yaakov Sasfortas that I was mentioning before, who served in Amsterdam. He is the only figure, I think, who served in all the major communities of the Western Sephardi Diaspora. Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, and Livorno. He was in all those places. London and Livorno for a very short time. Hamburg not in an official rabbinic capacity, and just barely tolerated in Amsterdam. So that was Sasfortas. He was in London 1664, 65, basically. Then is Shlomo Ayalon, and he was the Chacham in London from 1689 to 1699, at which time he was picked off from London by the Amsterdam community and brought to Amsterdam, where he served until he died in 1728. He was actually the chief Sephardi rabbi in Amsterdam during that time, which was a very eventful time. And the third figure is the person who took over from Ayalon in London was Chacham David Nieto, who served there until he also died, I think in the same year, I think 1728. I think that's right. And he had come from Italy. He had come from, I think, from Livorno. So those are the three figures I've been particularly interested in, and an especially rich collection of material is the material about Ayalon. A lot of people know about Sasfortas. As you may know, Yaakov Dweck recently published an enormous volume about him. And if that's not enough for you about Sasfortas, you can look at my master's thesis from the Hebrew University about Sasfortas. Right. And then David Nieto is pretty well known to people who are interested in these topics because of a biography by Yaakov Petkovsky and various articles. But Ayalon is, for some reason, sort of little known among people who are not kind of experts in this area. And partly it's because most of his writings are left in manuscript, and there is some amazing stuff there. So that's some of what we're going to be using here. So what we're looking at mostly in these documents is a correspondence between Chacham Shlomo Ayalon when he moves to London and takes over, and Chacham Yaakov Sasfortas, who at this point is in Amsterdam. And they are good friends. They are good friends, and you can sort of see why, because they are both coming from the Eastern Sephardi diaspora, Sasfortas from North Africa and Ayalon from Saloniki. And so you can understand their friendship and how they relate to each other, especially in dealing with London, which is like the Wild West of the Western Sephardi diaspora at this time a little bit. The real Wild West is, of course, the Americas, but this is, you know, a little bit. The irony, which I don't want to get into here, but the real irony about this is that what is the most famous thing about Yaakov Sasfortas that everybody knows? It is he was the key main great opponent of Shabtai Tzvi and the Sabbatean movement. Shlomo Ayalon, from his youth, a dedicated Sabbatean, to the point that he actually converted to Islam with the Donmeh and lived as a Muslim Donmeh Sabbatean for some period before returning to Judaism. And yet he bounced on over to Europe and was the leader of Amsterdam for almost 30 years, one of the most important Jewish communities in Europe at the time. Unbelievable. But that is all background. Okay, so there's we're going to look at wayward former conversos. First case, forbidden love. Forbidden love. Okay, a question and response preserved in a manuscript volume of notes and correspondence from the pen of Chacham Shlomo Ayalon, which consider the case of clandestine marriage among the conversos and its consequences. So I should say that clandestine marriage was a social problem, a political problem, an economic problem. It wasn't technically a religious problem, but we'll see how it gets turned into a religious problem and dealt with by the Hakhamim.
Matt, is this one of the shutim you sent me? Is this the old Yaakov? No, it's not going to be in the old.
No. The
Hebrew
original. I do not have a transcript of the Hebrew original. I translated it straight from the manuscript.
Oh, that's right. You told me that. Yes. Okay.
I apologize that I don't have a Hebrew original to show you. You just have to take my word that I'm at least close to the proper translation of all this. Let's hope so. So Ayalon was the Chacham of the congregation in London. This is a document from 1691. He received this query from his friend Chacham Sasfortas, who had been the Chacham in London and was now a Chacham in Amsterdam. Okay, so I published this in a little article in Zutot, which if you're interested, you can see. Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm sorry to be doing this, but I'll just read. If you want to screenshot it, then you can do that. Otherwise, people can follow along from their own copy or whatever you want. Here's a question which the great sage, the perfect and honored Rabbi Yaakov Sasfortas asked me. This concerns a certain converso from among the forced converts of our times. He had been in Bayonne, a place where he was free to have himself circumcised. In other words, there was no inquisition, and he did not do so. So the situation Bayonne, Bordeaux was Saint-Jean-de-Luz, that whole area in southern France, was that officially it was illegal to be a Jew there, but there was no inquisition. There was nobody to keep you from doing it. And because these people had a lot of trade connections and brought in money, their community was a sort of open secret there, and they even had rabbis after a certain point. So there's a lot to say about that, but that's the situation in those communities. By this point, they were either about to or had just recently become officially permitted. So that's where this guy is, in Bayonne. He cast his eyes upon a certain woman whom he wished to take for himself and spoke to her of his desire. She responded to him in the presence of her brethren, God forbid that I should give myself to an uncircumcised man and without kiddushin and the 7 blessings, the Shabbat brachot. The said converso promised to have himself circumcised immediately, but wanted first to become engaged to her. But he asked about the kiddushin and how it's performed. She told him that he has to give her a ring before 2 witnesses. He immediately brought 2 disreputable witnesses. This is a repeating theme in these documents, is the disreputable witnesses who show up. Now, what makes them disreputable may not be as much who they are, as much as that the rabbis don't want this to happen. And if they can puzzle the witnesses, then right, they can quash the whole event. Okay, and he gives her a ring. All felt that this brought matters to a conclusion. He would now complete the marriage and become circumcised. Oh, what a beautiful dream. Okay, this, however, was not the intention of the converso. He said that he needed to go to the city of Rouen. Now, Rouen was not a place that you could live as a Jew. Okay, because his house, all his property were there. but that after going there, he would move his residence to Amsterdam and do everything, that is, revert to Judaism openly. Okay, right? So believe me, I'm gonna move to Amsterdam. I'm gonna marry you. We're gonna have a great, I'm gonna circumcise myself. No problem. Just let me go to Rouen and get my stuff. Okay. The woman was swayed by his words, followed him without nisu'in. In other words, they did kiddushin, but no nisu'in. And there in Rouen, he lived with her as a man with his wife. He never did become circumcised, and he died there. Now the woman has come to Amsterdam crying in distress, wanting to know what her legal status is. Now, from the Bayonne Rabbinical Court, we have received confirmation of witnessing to the Kiddushin, explaining, okay, now watch very carefully what it says about these witnesses. Explaining that the two witnesses before whom the Kiddushin was performed are absolutely evil individuals. One of them transgresses Sabbaths and holidays publicly, and the other is a heretic who scorns the words of the sages and openly lends money at high interest. Those are the witnesses. If they're the witnesses and they are pasul le'edus, then you can simply be mevatel the whole kiddushin and nothing happened. And that is apparently where Sasfortas goes with this. The above mentioned rabbi Sasfortas agreed to permit the woman to market, that is, right, the shuk. She could remarry without performing chalitza, and he wanted to know whether I agreed with this ruling, and then he gives a long, complex reply in which he essentially agrees. So here we have several versions of the marginal converso. We have the woman who seems to be a fine, mainstream, right, Bayonne Jewish or woman of converso ancestry. She is seduced by a man who has been living in Rouen, where he had to be living as a Christian. He's not circumcised. He was living as a Christian. He knows nothing about Jewish practice. He doesn't know what kiddushin and nisuin are. He is all about getting this woman to be with him. And he tells her whatever he has to tell her. This is a clandestine marriage. Now, the other versions of the marginal conversos are these two witnesses. So look at the juxtaposition, look at the combination of halachic issues with them and moral, ethical, and let's say heretical issues, right? You put together the transgressions of Shabbat, the transgressions of Ribit, with heresy and mocking the Hakhamim. Those things all, right? You put them together, and then you have a mixture that you can work with as a rabbi to be mevatel kiddushin. So we learn about the rabbis and their problems and how they deal with things. And we also learn about this type of person in the community. All right. Any thoughts about this? Anybody want to say anything about that? That document? No? All right. So let's move on to number 2. Okay, so this is also relevant to this.
Matt, what year was that around? That's 18th century. 1691.
Okay. So Professor Kaplan, my teacher, in his studies of clandestine marriage, which he wrote an article, at least one article about, in the Western Sephardi Diaspora, presents texts of communal ordinances and cases from Amsterdam, Hamburg, Livorno, and Bordeaux. An ordinance of Bayonne from shortly after our incident, however, may reflect the influence of this particular case. In other words, apparently what happened in the case that we just talked about, that nobody would have known about except for this manuscript record, right, apparently caused a decision to make a particular communal ordinance, a takana. When a clandestine marriage episode arose in 1742, Chacham Moshe de Robles in Bayonne sent a question to his colleague in Carpentras concerning this ruling. In the letter, he included communal ordinances from 1700 and 1703. In other words, shortly after the incident that we were just talking about on this matter, the earliest extant in the record books. So when he looked in the record books in Bayonne, this is what he found, okay? And here's what the decree says, and this is from Freiman Seder Kiddushin B'Nisuin. Whereas His Honor, the Chacham Rav Yitzchak de Costa, demonstrated before the governors of the community that after he checked and carefully examined earlier ordinances and acted to disqualify Kiddushin given without permission by himself and in consultation with the honored rabbis of Amsterdam. Right? In other words, the rabbis, as representatives of the communal leadership, want to control marriage. Halachically, they don't have any control over this. It is a social issue, a class issue, an economic issue, but halacha shouldn't have anything particular to say about it. And yet, the rabbis are the representatives of the ma'amad, of the parnasim. They do the bidding of the wealthy leaders of the community who do not want men seducing women, and they do not want clandestine marriages. So they all do this in consultation. He found a need to explain certain details, blah, 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 blah. Look how they do it. Look toward the end of this document. They declare the money or object. This is about 4 or 5 lines from the bottom. The rabbis, look at how they turn this, a non-halachic issue, into a halachic issue for the purpose of doing the will of the parnasim and preventing clandestine marriages, right? The rabbis declare the money or object of value which the groom gives to be, in other words, the ring or the Shabbat pruta, which is given to the bride to do the kiddushim. The rabbis declare it to be public property, mafkirinoto. They make it hefker, right? In other words, at the moment that the guy gives the ring or the coin or whatever to the woman to do kiddushin, the rabbis virtually step in and they are mafkir that ring so that it does not belong to him anymore. And as we know in the halacha, for a marriage to be chal, to take effect, the ring has to belong to the chatan. The ring has to belong to the groom. They have just been mafkir it. I don't know on what halachic basis they're able to do this. I don't know where this method comes from, but I feel like it goes along with selling chametz or wearing a shekel. It's one of those rabbinic inventions that allow Jews to live the way they want to live. So they make it public property before it exits his hands, so that it is not considered to be his. It thus comes out that he has performed the kiddushin with an object not belonging to himself, and the kiddushin is therefore null and void. Batel mevutal, right? How do you like that? So here is where we see the Hakhamim doing the will of the communal leaders in an issue which would otherwise not enter into halacha. Okay.
But is there any religious motivation to want to stop it? In other words,
no. In other words, halacha has nothing to say about the status of the groom and the bride. It has nothing to say about the permission of assuming that the groom and the bride are not minors, right? They are free to essentially to make their own arrangements, right, and so on. The halacha shouldn't have any particular point of view on this. It's a social, a political, a class, and an economic issue.
It's about them not allowing, it's about controlling dowries and
That's
family
correct.
alliances and all that stuff, right? I mean,
Right.
it's right.
If you look, this is not in the Sephardi context, but it's close by. If you look in the memoirs of Glickle of Hamel, she's talking about one of her sons, right? And he says, I would prefer you to marry me to somebody from this city rather than that city, because that would be advantageous for me. It's all about the advantages, right? The economic, the social advantages of the particular shidduchim. So poor people should be marrying poor people, wealthy people of status should be marrying other wealthy people of status. There should be no cross-contamination. And where there is, right, and there are many examples of this, the leaders of the community get involved and they find ways to make it impossible using the rabbis.
Do you ever use kibbud av v'em as an argument?
Nah, nobody cares. If you look in the halacha, the parameters, the technical parameters of kibbud av v'em are very limited. They have to do with sitting in somebody's chair, making sure they have food to eat, things like that. This, yeah. It gets
Rav Moshe used kibbud av v'em as a reason of why someone shouldn't smoke marijuana, because their parents would be embarrassed. So
that might have been meaningful in 1960.
Yeah, exactly. Once their parents already smoked the marijuana, so then it stopped. Yes, but that was an interesting use of it. I was curious. It came to mind because that is
right.
Could they impose?
That's another example of a rabbi being creative about finding a halachic reason to enforce social control.
Sure.
Right. All right. With 8 minutes on the clock, right? Let's look at my second set of material, Wayward Former Conversos 2, Ritual Laxity and the Fence Sitter. So this is more specifically about the kinds of people that I'm especially interested in, these sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out people. So here, Sasfortas is vituperating against practices of the former Conversos in Perelis, which is a small town near Bayonne. And he talks about, again, the relationship in his mind really comes through between ritual laxity, heterodoxy, and the converso background. Those 3 things, right, sort of combine. So let's just look at this quickly. I've seen a description of the arrangements in that place, talking about Perelis. It's a little tiny village, apparently. Of that place of darkness, they are not ordered by the times of Sabbaths and holy days. Sasfortas is very difficult to translate. I give it to Yaakov who does a really beautiful job translating, because Sasfortas is Hebrew, is very kind of poetic and alliterative and so on. Anyway, rather, holy is changed to profane for a bit of silver, a few small coins. They do business and enjoy the illicit profits gained on the Sabbath. This is one of the major complaints about these conversos, right? These sort of marginal figures who do business on Shabbat. In London, early on in the life of the community, there's actually a case of somebody who's a member of the Ma'amad, and he goes to the synagogue, to the synagogue on Shabbat morning, and then he goes to the church on Sunday morning to cover all his bases. Anyway, it reminds you of the story of Eliyahu at Har HaKarmel, right? Ad matai tifsichu al shtei seifim, however he puts it, right? How long are you going to sit on the fence? Okay, they do business and enjoy the illicit profits gained on the Sabbath. They're selling eternal life in exchange for the life of the moment. It might almost be said of them that they know their master and rebel against him intentionally. So this is the conversos who do not want to conform. And he is able to see the situation only from his point of view, from the world of people who are steeped in Jewish law and ideas from their youth. So to him, it looks like these are people who are deliberately flouting and going against everything, as opposed to understanding that they are coming from a world, from generations of people who practice Christianity, especially those in Perelis, which is, again, sort of the Wild West, the frontiers of the Western Sephardi diaspora, right? These are not the heavily dedicated conversos who want to be fully practicing Jews. They're fence sitters, but he doesn't see it that way, right? Excuses are made for them, and people want to exempt them from punishment by saying they're anusim, they're conversos. This is just a way of keeping their enemies away from their money. In other words, he's saying it's not about that. They just want to keep their money. They have no concern for the respect of their maker, who knows that it is happening, what is happening deep within their hearts and their consciences. What will they do on the day they must surrender their souls and face judgment and punishment? This Sasfortas is the fire and brimstone rabbi. He is all about this, okay? Their very limbs will testify to their activities of their holy days, though we might read it, their testimony. What exactly is the compulsion, the ones on them? In other words, why do they have to do this? They don't have to do this to be open on Shabbat. It is nowhere to be seen in a land where the government, may God protect it, has with the utmost graciousness extended its right hand to receive them, granting each man sovereignty over his own household to observe his own religion. In other words, in France, where they live, they can practice their own religion. The government won't bother them. There's no ones anymore, right? They're not anusim anymore. They're no longer forced to practice, right, to break the Shabbat. It is only his own evil inclination that sells him down the wrong path for the love of mammon. They have voluntarily chosen Gehinnom, hell, right, and subjugation to foreign governments. For our redemption and the reclamation of our souls depend on observance of the Shabbat. Did they not know or understand that observance of the Shabbat is as weighty as all the rest of the Torah combined? It's a rhetorical question, but the answer is probably no. They didn't know. How would they know? They didn't study Torah. They didn't grow up as Jews. What do they know, right? Profanation of the Shabbat, listen to this, and here this is actually based in Chazal, also bears the width of idolatry, because it is through the Shabbat that we know our belief about the creation of the world and about the existence of Creator who is powerful and providential, right? So remember that Aristotle is the classic Ovid Avodah Zarah and Kofer, because he believes that the world is eternal. The Jews' faith is based in the story of Bereshit, that the world has a specific starting point. The profaner of the Shabbat rejects that to which is testified about him, as well as the Torah in which God instructed us to be written about his resting. In other words, by profaning the Shabbat, you are sort of spitting in God's face, because God says explicitly to keep the Shabbat. He who profanes it turns the sacred into the secular, nor can his transgression be forgiven. Okay, with 2 minutes on the clock, here is Shlomo Ayalon. This is probably from 1689, because this is from a notebook from around 1689, 1690. And Ayalon had just arrived in London, and he writes a letter to Sasfortas. And this letter is actually answered in the response of Sasfortas, is his response to this letter. But this letter was in manuscript, so nobody had seen it before, so nobody knew that the tshuva that Sasfortas had written was an answer to this question. So he opens up with a bunch of praises for Sasfortas, and he says, after praying sincerely that you would be preserved from the sickness and granted long life, happiness, and he was, by the way, Sasfortas lived to be 88. Great joy, please be it so forever. I will go on to inform you concerning that which you are already familiar, that is, the ways of persons who transgress in their soul, and those of Israel who sin with their bodies. Their households are of the other side, the Sitra Achra, and their activities on Sabbath and sacred holidays are identical to those of their weekdays. The store is open and the merchant goes around collecting his due. They have passed by like a swift ship and removed themselves from the community of their own volition. So again, this is a whole category of conversos who have become sort of Jewish, sort of joined the community, and sort of not. And they are one of the worst problems for the rabbis, because the members of the community, the full-fledged members of the community, always have these people on the margins. They're always peeking over the fence and seeing these people. Okay, now look what it says. Right, look right in the middle of the next paragraph. Concerning these other wicked men, who are Mechalei Shabbos, the Christians say, what are these wretched Jews doing on their day of rest, their holidays and Sabbaths? Where's the observance of their religion? Where then are the scholars of their Torah that they don't protest it? This is because in these religions, there's no compulsion against passing up religion, but concerning all the actions of these evildoers, they are abominable as a rotten animal carcass, even in the eyes of the Gentiles. In other words, again, as we mentioned, the Christians are always looking into the Jewish community, and what they expect of Jews is to keep, again, like the Hoshta thought, right? The Christians expect Jews to be the people of the Bible, and when they see them being the Halel Shabbat, right, they not only speak between themselves, but Ayalon says, right, it becomes known that they're looking at the Jews and they're shocked to see that they are Mechalei Shabbat. Okay. It is known in the whole holy congregation of Israel that these empty and rash persons have rebellious souls, that they are loathsome, their wives are vermin, right? These people do not pull punches. The wives are vermin and their offspring are just like them. They are all an assembly of renegades who openly desecrate Sabbaths and holidays in the same way they scorn the words of the rabbi. So look again at that juxtaposition, right? The halachic issue of Shabbat together with the heresy. They always come together, right? They scorn the words of the rabbis in public, and here he's going to add another halachic issue. They are all kakate de lo manche tefillah, right? They are heads that do not don phylacteries, which is a phrase from the Gemara. Nor are there fringes on their garments, so they don't wear talis and tefillin, or mezuzah on their doors, and they shave their beards with a blade. All their actions are those of complete Gentiles. So why do you care about them? Because they're still partly in the community. They haven't just gone their own way. There are plenty of conversos who just go their own way and have nothing to do with the Jewish community at this point. But these people are in, and as you learn, if you look at the rest of the document, the issue that came up, right? Look at just what comes next. Now, because the situation in these regions is that these apostates are contemptuous in the eyes of the most important Gentiles, they claim we are Jews. They identified themselves as Jews. They don't have to do that, but they do that. They have no portion in Jacob, etc. And he goes on to talk about a situation where some of these people who live outside the Eruv they want to have a bris milah for their son. In other words, they do want to do circumcision, but they want people to come from the community outside the tchum, right, outside the Sabbath boundary, and they want to serve food which may not be kosher and so on, right? This is the worst problem, right? You could deal with the Spinoza and the Costa because they're radicals, they're heretics, they're completely, right? They've broken from the community. But these people, what are you going to do with them? They're fence sitters, they're half in, half out, and they are part of the Nassau. They are part of the cultural world of the members of the community, right? They exist in every community of the Western Sephardim. The more central community, Amsterdam, probably has less of an issue with this. The further out you go, the bigger a problem this type of person is. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone 4 minutes over time, but I'm happy to discuss anything. I see there are a few comments here. How did the She'elah get to London? Did a rabbi in Bayonne, Bordeaux send it to London? The She'elah actually arrived in Amsterdam, I believe, and then the Amsterdam rabbi Sasfortas sent it to his friend in London. the way letters got around, right? We may be returning to this, by the way, if you followed the news about the postal service. The way that letters got around is that you found somebody going to where you needed the letter to go, and you had it hand delivered by somebody. And often people sent multiple copies of letters because they knew that, you know, if Ralph goes down with the ship, then you know, Murgatroyd will get it there, you know, over land or whatever it is. But that's how letters moved around. That's a bigger question. Also interesting that they do not impugn the Jewish status of the groom. Right. Now, of course, so that's an excellent point. Their concern is really mostly for the bride, who is part of the Jewish community. And in terms of children, the husband's status, not so important. But right, it's a good point that they are not doing what might seem to be the obvious thing, and worrying about the halachic status of the groom. Yeah. Any other thoughts on any of this? So that's the rabbis of the Western Sephardi Diaspora. They had a lot on their plates. Often they had to look the other way and pretend not to see what was going on among their community members, but they faced a big mess. And I have said in an article that in many ways, these people, these fence-sitting conversos that these rabbis had to contend with all the time, are in a lot of ways the first modern Jews, right? This idea of the nation, of this, right? There are Jews and there's the nation, and there's overlap, but they are not identical categories. This idea of sort of being a member of an ethnic community, and picking and choosing which Jewish practices you wish to practice and which you are going to ignore. This interesting combination of the halachic and the heretical transgressions, right, that seem to be locked together all the time. It gives you some idea of the world in which these rabbis practiced. All right.
Well, I want to just thank you. And I want to thank everyone who signed on, who's been a part of this tonight. I learned a tremendous amount, as I knew I would. And I hope everyone here did as well. I'm sure they did. And I'm so happy to have hosted you here at Revel. And this is not the first time, and I look forward to many more. And our students have always benefited from the particular approach you're able to bring to this material. And it's really just very, very much appreciated. And thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in the flesh at some point. And my students in particular, if you have questions that you'd like, I can get you in touch with Professor Goldish. And also, if there are things that we've discussed tonight that you want to explore further in the course, please let me know. I also want to just put a plug in for a wonderful event this coming Wednesday at noon New York time. There's a time change in this part of the world. Noon New York time. It's an event that Revel is co-sponsoring. We are hosting former Ambassador Dan Shapiro, Ambassador to Israel. He'll be in dialogue with Rabbi Yosef Blau, which should make for a really, really interesting, insightful conversation about the state of the Middle East and where we're going, and where Ambassador Shapiro clearly has connections in the current administration. So it's interesting where things will move. So that is, you can look that up at Crisis and Hope, yu.edu Crisis and Hope, and it's Wednesday at noon, or you can email me. And I just want to thank everyone again for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Professor Goldish. And I think is there another question coming in?
Should I respond to this real quick?
Please.
Are the response from this era directed directly at conversos still living under the Inquisition in Portugal? There are definitely she'elot and tshuvot concerning their status and what the rabbis think of them, but they are not directed to them. In other words, Hey, the last thing you need is to be a Portuguese converso receiving a letter from the
Oh, look at
rabbi
I go.
about a death sentence, right? There's actually, every once in a while, one of these people is caught with writings of Menashe ben Israel or somebody. It's a death sentence. So no, the Shuvot are not directed to them. The big letter arrives in the mail. It says, you know, OU, Orthodoxy and Halachic Services Division. No. Thank you for these really nice comments. I really appreciate that. Okay. Have a lovely evening. Shabbat shalom.